Hi everyone, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and today I've got a full tank review for you on the TT-130M. This is going to be a tier 9 Czechoslovakian heavy tank that is from the Battle Pass, and as you can see, this vehicle is the first non-Chinese tank to have rockets inside World of Tanks. But just because it has rockets, does that mean that it's going to be any good? Well, that's my job today, to let you know if this thing is going to be worth the hefty price tag of all of the Battle Pass tokens that you're going to have to spend. To be able to get the TT-130M, you're going to have to be able to collect these tokens over the upcoming next 3 seasons of the Battle Passes. It'll be over the next 9 months, starting from next Wednesday, the 6th of March. And every season, you can collect 15 tokens for a base reward, or you can manage to get 9 additional tokens if you spend 2,500 gold on each of the 3 chapters within each of the 3 seasons. Now, the TT-130M is going to cost 20 tokens, so if you were so inclined, you could manage to get one in the first season of the Battle Pass. However, the other new vehicle, which is the TS-60, is going to cost 28 tokens. Now, you're not going to be able to get enough. You can only get 24 in the first season, and so you're going to have to wait until Season 2 starts in June and collect those tokens as well if you want to be able to get yourself the TS-60. It also should be mentioned that considering it will cost 48 tokens to be able to get each of these 2 new vehicles, that unless you're willing to buy at least one of the premium passes at 2,500 gold, even if you were to complete all of the base rewards in each of the 3 seasons, there will be not enough tokens to be able to get both of these new tanks, let alone collecting some of the old ones that maybe you missed out on. So I wanted to start this review with the caveat that when the new season starts, don't rush to spend your tokens on the TT-130M if you might consider that the tier 9 American reward tank destroyer, the TS-60, is going to be more your kind of thing. So with all of that said and done, let's see how the TT-130M stacks up to the BZ-68. So firstly, I want to highlight just how good the Chinese tier 9 is. Let's see how it's working compared to all of the other vehicles at tier 9. We can see the BZ-68, it's in 5th place behind the AMX M4, 51, 705, E75 and Conqueror with regards to win rate difference. And when we look at raw win ratio, it is actually getting the best of any of the tech tree heavy tanks, although it does have the best players playing it. So take this into account when we're comparing the Czechoslovakian reward vehicle to the Chinese tech tree heavy tank. So immediately we notice the TT-130M has less alpha damage than the BZ-68, even though both of these vehicles are using 130mm. The 130M having 490, while the 68 has 530. In addition to this, with the improved alpha damage and not that much worse rate of fire, the BZ-68 has a slight damage per minute advantage, although it is minor. However, the penetration, again, a minor advantage at 4mm of standard pen. And when we look at the heat, it's 315 heat compared to APCR of 306. So this will mean that the TT-130PM will kind of be better against spaced armor and arguably against surfaces that are angled by at least 2 degrees. However, the BZ-68 with that 315 heat will be better against long-range targets, as remember, heat rounds don't have any penetration drop-off. Fortunately, the 130M has enough ammunition to be able to destroy most of the enemy team at 40 shells, so you can take more than enough regular gold rounds and also HE rounds, depending on what the job is. Gun handling wise, the 130M has a slight advantage over the BZ-68 with 0.3 better aim time, 0.02 better accuracy, but let me clarify, this is not good accuracy for a heavy tank. You're going to be whiffing a lot of shells. However, the dispersion when moving is significantly worse than the 68 and only a hairbreadth better with regards to its turret traverse dispersion. But the real main difference between these tanks is that the TT-130M has 5 degrees of gun depression, whereas the BZ-68 has 8, which is definitely one of the best features of the Chinese rocket heavy. So now onto the mobility of the TT-130M. It's got a top speed that's limited by 30 with a reverse speed of 14. However, immediately it should be mentioned that the TT-130M has the ability to take a field mod to increase the top speed by 2 kilometers an hour, which will mean that it could go at 32 now. Now that's important because of the way that rockets work. Rockets increase the base top speed by 50%, and it also takes into things like field mods and also equipment. So if you're able to put a turbo on this tank, which will increase the top speed by 4 outside of a slot, when you use the rockets, it's actually going to go up to a 54 kilometer an hour top speed limit, which is way better than the base speed of 30 if you don't have the field mods and don't have a turbo on this tank as well. However, unfortunately, the power to weight ratio on this vehicle is just under 11, and it actually has massively worse ground resistances than the BZ-68, making this oh so much more sluggish than the Chinese tank, unless you are using those rockets, which kind of mitigate that, because as soon as you are, your power to weight ratio is going up to 35. So you're kind of more of like a very fast medium tank, if not a slower light tank upslope. So all in all, not really great news here for the TT-130M. I'd say it has overall worse firepower than the BZ-68. Its gun handling is better in some regards, but significantly worse in others. And it's overall significantly slower than the BZ-68 with those horrible ground resistances. So maybe its armor is going to be its speciality. Well, maybe. 130 at the front of the hull and 70 at the side, that feels more like tier 9 medium tank armor with regards to the hull. However, 300 on the front of the turret and 150 on the side of the turret does look chonky indeed. However, when we take a look at the armor model that this vehicle has, we quickly see that it has quite a few issues. Firstly, the lower plate is trash. All vehicles apart from tier 7s will be able to pen that very easily frontally. You're going to have to over-angle the vehicle significantly as you come around the corner for it to be an auto ricochet. However, the tank does have 55 millimeters of spaced armor over the upper hull, which means that unless your opponents bypass this and shoot through the gaps to the left and the right when they're aiming down on this hull, that they're easily going to struggle to go through this thing when it's using any of its kind of gun depression. So for example, if we're using 5 degrees, the upper hull on this tank is actually 300 millimeters of effective armor. That's very good. And remember, space protection will provide better protection against heat. The armor on the side of this tank is also really weird. It's basically like the Skoda T56. Mean that you can over-angle the side and have these wonderful ricochets off this curved upper part of the side armor. However, remember that if you do this, then the weak point is going to be just above the tracks. And also, it should be mentioned that like with the VZ55, it has a steep angle along the lower part of the side armor, which means that you do actually pull off quite a few miracle ricochets with this tank. I'd be quite happy to just angle it at 45 degrees and side scrape on this vehicle, and unless they hit the bar along here where there's no space protection, or they shoot right above the tracks, avoid the angled part of the hull here, and then go through the tracks and into the side, this is a very solid tank. The problem with the turret is that while it does have this same 55 millimeters of space protection, which provides it with pretty good strength armor from the side against most tanks it's going to meet, it does have this very prominent cupola. And while it is 200 millimeters thick, that's going to hold up against tier 7s and a lot of tier 8s. It doesn't really hold up against the 9s and the 10s that this vehicle is mostly going to be meeting. And this weak point, unlike the BZ-68, where you've got 8 degrees of gun depression, this thing only has 5, so you can never truly hide it if you are also shooting your opponents, and it was an incredibly frustrating aspect of the tank for me. So in addition to this pretty darn good armor, the vehicle has 1,850 hit points. It's enough to keep it in the game. However, its view range at 380 is disappointing unless you're willing to use a premium consumable with great cruise skills and you've got the final field mod. Your view range is going to struggle unless you take vents on this tank. So how about the crew? Well, a lot of you will be very happy to know that this tank has a standard crew, which is unusual for wargaming recently, and your VZ55 crew or your Skoda T56 crew are going to fit perfectly in this vehicle, so it's a great crew trainer. I would thoroughly recommend to have a 0 skill commander on this vehicle, as they're also the radio operator. You want brothers in arms, repairs, recon, and situational awareness before you're even reasonably competitive on this tank. With regards to your gunner, brothers, repairs, then I'd be taking things like snapshot to improve the gun handling, then possibly deadeye and designated target to be able to provide some vision flexibility and some extra chance to damage your opponent's modules. I'd take brothers in arms on your driver, repairs, and then I'd take things like smooth ride to be able to fix that awful dispersion when you're moving, and also off-road driving to fix the horrible ground resistance that this vehicle has before you're taking things like clutch braking and then preventative maintenance or even controlled impact, because when you've got rockets, it's actually pretty nice to be ramming your opponents. The loader is really simple. Doesn't really need to be a 0 skill. Just take brothers, repairs, and then take things like safe stowage to prevent ammo racks and intuition so you can be a little bit cheaper. With regards to equipment on this tank, I'm running 2 builds on this vehicle. One is going to be vents, a turbo, and a gun rammer to try and focus on getting forwards and focusing on the firepower of the tank. And my second build on this tank is going to be dropping the gun rammer for a durability for those maps where I'm taking risky push plays and I can't afford to have my tracks locked down. However, you may find on this tank that you want to, say, drop something like the vents or even the gun rammer to use vertical stabilizers, because otherwise the gun handling on this tank is just horrible. And when you sit stationary, you do make the weak point on top of your tank very easy to hit. So you don't want to stay still for long, and vert stabs can help you with not staying still for long. Field mods on this tank are super simple. Firstly, take all-terrain suspension to be able to improve the awful ground resistances this vehicle has, then enhance the accuracy of the tank, then improve the mediocre view range. For the slot, I'd recommend a turbo, so I'd take a mobility slot here. And for the final field mod, definitely take the top speed limit on this tank so you can increase yourself, especially when you are using the rockets. But with all that said and done, let's take this pretty well-rounded heavy tank out onto the battlefield. So firstly, I'm going to be rolling out on Karelia in a top-tier matchup against some tier 8 tanks as well. And at the start of the battle, you want to use your rockets to be able to get into position. However, there's something that I didn't mention in the statistics review of this vehicle, and that is that it only gets 4 rocket charges, which is the same as the tier 8 Chinese rocket heavies. For some reason, Wargaming are actually giving non-Chinese vehicles less amounts of charges, or shall I, not even the non-Chinese vehicles. What I mean to say is the BZ-72-1 only had 5, whereas the BZ-75 has 6, and now the TT-130M has 4 charges, whereas the BZ-68 has 5. So I don't know why Wargaming is doing this with the reward vehicles. Maybe they're just trying to limit their mobility within that regard. However, while that can be annoying later on in the battle, because you'll have less charges to be able to go after your opponents, yeah, 4 charges is still enough of driving along at pretty much about 50 kilometers an hour to be able to race into position. And that's exactly what I've done here. I've got forwards. I know there's an arty, but I'm going to be taking a risk anyway with the artillery shells. And luckily, the space protection on this tank, on the turret and the hull, can provide you with a little bit of support, but really it's the lower plate armor that's going to matter here. And you'll notice just how careful I'm having to be with driving around to be able to not make this thing bloom out. And uh-oh, ugly weak point has been achieved, right? They've gone right through the top weak point on this tank, and it looks like one also bypassed the space protection, just went through the turret front there from the T-103 or the 703 too. And this vehicle, it's really hit and miss with regards to whether the armor works, but I think that you have to just keep poking. It's the kind of tank where there's really just RNG protection, I found with this vehicle. I tried to play it really carefully and try to, for example, only side scrape around corners where it wouldn't expose my weak point. But I did find that this vehicle, if you tried to play it like that, it didn't feel very special. It didn't have the firepower. It didn't really have the consistency in the gun. And I just found myself having such mediocre results. I think this tank is a push tank. I think it's a vehicle that needs to make use of those rockets, like on the Chinese rocket heavies. And if you don't, I think it's just thoroughly mediocre. So we're just going to wait for the stun to end here so our accuracy improves. And we're going to finish off the T-103 behind the little bit of cover there. And this is really just this tank in a nutshell. You're sitting out in the open-ish on a ridgeline, and you're just dumping shells and hoping that you can manage to outtrade your opponents. It's actually pretty okay for these static fights. However, as you're going to see later on, not so good for when we're required to use a mobility, and you're going to be shocked by just how poor the performance of this vehicle is when we don't get to use rockets. So I am spamming gold here at my opponents. This vehicle, because of its poor accuracy and its poor gun handling, I think really does do well with some premium round compensation. However, remember, this is a reward tank. This is not a premium tank. And so if you are spamming gold as much as this, you're going to have a hard time. Another thing to mention is this vehicle's standard rounds at 244 millimeters. It doesn't really feel like it's tier 9 within that regard. And while the shells still work when you manage to shoot up into weak points, so to say, of tier 8 tank destroyers, when I was in my tier 9 and tier 10 games, man, this tank just felt like I didn't have the firepower to truly deal with my opponents. And so this vehicle, I'd really like to question what it's designed to do. Sure, it's managed to get into this position. Sure, it's managed to get these shots off. But is it doing anything that a T10 wouldn't have? I'd rather play a T10, honestly. I feel like the T10 has got just as good armor, at least not on the upper hull, but with regards to exposing its turret. And I feel like the T10 has way better firepower potential. Sure, it loses a little bit of alpha damage, But dude, it's got 340 millimeters of heat pen, which you can just whiff at tanks and be able to get away with a lot more than the paltry 306 millimeters of pen that you're going to have on these APCR rounds. But look, it's a tier 9 heavy. It's not statistically that much worse than the BZ-68. And remember, the BZ-68, I showed you, has some of the best statistics of any of the tier 9 heavies. So if Wargaming was to put a reward vehicle into the game that kind of had equal or better statistics than the BZ-68, then that would probably be quite damaging for the matchmaker. But all in all with this vehicle, it's just good in a position like this. But I would just question whether this is exciting gameplay for a lot of players. No judgment. If this is exciting gameplay for you, that's absolutely fine. For me, this is the best kind of result that I could get with the vehicle. Literally to just trundle into position. Well, trundle isn't the right word. You do race into position. But once you've got there, good luck in being able to get away from that position. You really do have to sleep in the bed that you've made, you know. It's not a case of you think, oh, well, I get those fancy sheets out now, that maybe I could sleep somewhere else, or maybe I could have a nice pillow in this kind of situation. No, you made your bed, you're going to sleep in it with this tank, and that can be really frustrating. It really can. I did end up finding myself just completely bored in this vehicle in quite a few scenarios, that it's just so inflexible with that 5 degrees of gun depression, so unspecial with regards to the gun. There are tier 9 tanks that have way better alpha damage than this. You've got way better alpha on, well, the BZ-68. You've got way better alpha on the 50 TP, on the E-75, on the Type 4 Heavy. There are many tech tree tanks that are just so much more special than this. And then it's competition in the form of tier 9 Czechoslovakian heavy tank. The TNH VZ-51 has an autoloader that deals 880 damage, albeit within 3 seconds of the first shot. And oh dear, looks like the armor finally fell through. Looks like the T-30 got a gold round right through my lower plate there. Not sure if I was blocking that with my fat head in this scenario. But look, I can't fault the tank for its performance. We basically just sat out in front of artillery and multiple tanks for 7 minutes. That's strong. 5,500 combined. Amazing result for a tier 9 tank. However, was it the most engaging, exciting gameplay? No, definitely not. And you're going to see just how slow this vehicle is. And the lack of flexibility once you've managed to have that kind of... You go in the ditch and you either die in the ditch or you manage to push out. That's it. There's no real opportunities for flanking. There's no real opportunities for crazy firepower. There's no opportunities for the vehicle to have wild gun depression. It's basically just a... Even with the turbo here, we can see this is going to be turbo performance upslope. Look at the speedometer. This is 10 kilometers upslope. You can see I'm just thinking, yeah, I'm having to entertain myself, right? I probably knew this was going to be a YouTube game. Is this the equivalent of a twerking tank? I don't know, possibly. Maybe. No. Yeah, having a little bit of a wiggle, just having a good time. Okay, Mr. TT-130. I guess you're going to have to find ways to entertain yourself when you're driving up fairly innocent slopes. It's not the most steep slope in World of Tanks history. It's definitely not the most shallow one. But boy, this tank does feel slow. And remember, this is with a turbo. A lot of you out there will be thinking, oh, what am I going to have to give up equipment-wise if I want to take this? Well, for me, it was the durability and the vert stabs on this tank. Both modules that I think that this vehicle could truly benefit from. Considering that it doesn't have the gun depression, it is a tank that will end up side-scraping and having to expose its hull with its only 5 degrees of gun depression. So a durability device will be very nice on this vehicle. But trust me, the accuracy and the aim time on this vehicle feel horrible without having vents on it. So I think that probably one of the better modules to drop on this tank when you get into those kind of situations will be the gun rammer. To focus on making your shots count rather than just getting as many shots down the line as possible. Which is why you saw that one of my builds on this vehicle does drop the gun rammer and uses the durability device instead. I'd almost recommend always having the turbo on this in pretty much every situation, because otherwise it just feels so darn slow, even with the field mod. And I feel that Wargaming could have given this tank significantly better ground resistances. It can't even get up to its natural top speed limit of 30 along medium. Now, of course, once you've got the field mods, you can improve the ground resistances. Once you've got things like off-road driving, and you've got some brothers in arms and cruise skill and all of this, then you will be able to. But remember, that's along the flat. It's struggling to get up to its top speed limit along the flat. And we finally use our final rocket once we got spotted by the T-30. So I was really worried about the artillery, or the G-Saw managing to finish us off. Again, I'm trying to entertain myself here. Luckily, this time we're actually going up slope at 18. The G-Saw ricochets off our tank, and that's definitely one of the better things about this vehicle, is that the armor does feel very forgiving, and it feels very friendly within that regard. And apart from that horrible weak point that we have on top of this tank, which is exposed to pretty much everything the whole time. If this tank had 8 degrees of gun depression, like its T&H brother does, or the BZ-68 does, then it could be able to hide that weak point on top while it's still engaging its opponents. But with only 5 degrees, it's just not able to do that, which again is just so frustrating, and you just feel like you have to nurse the ridgelines. However, nice to be able to get some revenge on that artillery that's been trying to have a go at us the entire game. And with 3 kills to our name, we're trying to find that shot on the BZ-68 as our adrenaline rush goes off. His turret should be exposed right now, and there we go. And I guess it's fairly fitting that Uncle QuickyBaby manages to finish off the vehicle, the BZ-68, which is this tank's biggest competition, at least within that regard. And I was very happy with 6,400 combined here. This was definitely a cherry-picked game. I'm not going to lie. This was a cherry-picked game. It was one of the better results of the tank. And considering how boring the gameplay was, yeah, I'm not trying to pretend that this tank is exciting. So first class here for the TT-130 steel wall, high caliber. That 4,700 damage that we dealt with the 2,000 assistance, yeah, 6,800 combined, very nice. Our accuracy, however, 22 shots, 17 hits, and 12 pens. And we fired a lot of gold ammo in this game, so we actually ended up losing 22,000 credits, so it's definitely not going to be a 1 for anyone who wants to play economically. So we're rolling out on mines. What do you think Uncle QuickyBaby is going to do in this tier 10 and tier 8 matchup? That's right, we're going to boost the rockets and we're going to contest the hill. On this kind of a map, I guess I could try and like sit in this alcove here or try to poke this window. Or I could try and make my way around the east and try and do some side scraping. This tank does do very well side scraping around kind of like a left-hand corner here, because obviously your weak point will be covered by the inner pillar. However, you know what? I just want to go. So I'm going to put some pressure on this VZ-55. And you can see that over-angling this vehicle there, you can really put some pressure up on your opponents. And now that I know that he's backed off and doesn't want to fight a hold down TT-130PM, not PM-M even, then I can just rocket up. And those rockets are literally just to be able to get you into an advantageous position. It is enough from that regard. But again, I'd like to highlight that unlike the BZ-68, you are going to struggle with your gun depression here. I can't depress. I want to shoot my opponents. Come on. And oh, the gun handling holds me back. So if I was a BZ-68, I would have undoubtedly shot that Conqueror before they managed to come in. And I would have hit that T-95 easy peasy. But again, 5 degrees is 5 degrees. You do have the advantages with regards to that upper hull armor. Although, when I think about it, not really that much of an advantage compared to a BZ-68. And that's really what I would come to with the kind of like the conclusion to this vehicle, is that it's basically a worse BZ-68 in so many areas. And all of you out there would know, what would you rather play? The tank that has the extra rocket charge that you can either use to get into position or use to be able to, I don't know, pull off some kind of ramming maneuver later on the battle. Would you rather play the tank that has 8 degrees of gun depression? Would you rather play the tank that has the higher alpha? Would you rather play the tank that has high explosive anti-tank rounds so you can be flexible and go through thinly armored surfaces that are angled up to 85 degrees? Would you rather have no weak point on top of the turret? I'd say that the TT-130 does better against tier 8 and tier 7 tanks. But I'd say that the BZ-68 does way, way better against probably the 9s and the 10s. And the reason for that is that as soon as your opponents have 200 20 millimeters of pen. They can easily go through the weak point on this tank. And as soon as they have decent premium rounds as well, they can even go through the upper hull armor on this vehicle. They can't really do that so much on the BZ-68. If the BZ-68 is using its 8 degrees of gun depression, its turret is very good. It doesn't have the weak point. And I'd say the upper hull armor is, at that stage, if they're firing really good gold pen, it doesn't matter if they're shooting at a TT-130M or a BZ-68. And so I don't know about you, but I think I'd rather play the tank that does better against in all matchups, rather than one that might be superior when we're playing against in those 1 in 5 times where we actually get to meet tier 7 and tier 8 tanks exclusively. So the ammo rack, even with safe stowage, a little bit of a vulnerability there against the Ferdinand. But we're just putting ourselves out here and just putting some pressure on our opponents. We used the rockets to get up on the hill, and we've managed to pull off 5,000 combined in 3.5 minutes. But I'd say this is more us using decent positions rather than the tank's capabilities. I do think that I would have done just as much, if not more, in other tier 9 heavies. However, I would also like to say that I think that every heavy, apart from maybe the BZ-68, wouldn't have been able to get up here so cleanly as this tank does. So from that regard, the TT-130 does have some strengths. And with these tank reviews, part of the tank review has to be me letting you know whether the tank is worth it, and the other part of me has to be letting you know how to play the vehicle if you've decided you want to purchase it or you've already got your hands on it as well. Unfortunately, it looks like I was just a little bit over-angled there, and probably the enemy managed to go through the track part here and also into the upper hull of this tank. As remember, if he hits me in the lower part, that's going to be angled. If he hits me in the upper part, it's going to be angled. And I do feel like I might be a little bit over-angled there. Should have probably put the gun over this area. That would have been more efficient side scraping. But so far, my feelings about this vehicle are I wouldn't really recommend spending the tokens on it. I think there's got to be better choices out there inside the Battle Pass. And it's really making this tank a hard sell from Wargaming's behalf. So now I want to highlight just how annoying this weak point on top of the tank is when combined with how bad the gun depression is and how bad the gun handling is. It's why I would recommend that if you find yourself incredibly frustrated by this tank, that you do take vertical stabilizers on it, because you just can't sit still for long. And as soon as you do, then that weak point on top of your vehicle is going to become the easy target for the enemies. We can already start to see them targeting it, wanting it to turn into Swiss cheese, and driving up in front of this T95 and the VK just feels almost like wrong within that regard. And when you combine that with just not the best accuracy, not the best pen, not even on the standard rounds, let alone the gold rounds. And from the firepower perspective, this vehicle doesn't really feel like the Juggernaut. I think it does do better at decent distances when it's on a ridgeline, shooting at surfaces which are larger and flatter, and it's able to pen. But you could say that for every kind of vehicle, right? The TNH, again, hits our weak point. The T95 bounces a gold round. And we can see that this armor is working out. We blocked 2,000 so far. But it's frustrating, boys and girls. It really is. I just wish this vehicle had 8 degrees. Look at that! That's the epitome of this tank. We can't even see our opponent's weak points. We don't have the gun depression to be able to go through them. And they have, as I said, turned the top of the tank into Swiss cheese. And I can tell you, this is going to happen time and time again. This is just so much of a frustrating problem with this tank. It really is. Whereas with a BZ-68, you don't really have that weak point. And when you are using your 8 degrees of gun depression, it's non-existent. And considering that this vehicle is Czechoslovakian, you'd hope it would have the same kind of flexibility that the VZ-55 or the Teenage VZ-51 has, but it's just not the case. And so that's why I would end up thoroughly not recommending this vehicle, purely from a frustration perspective. But I also have to admit that this tank's armor is really cool. To have that upper hull with the space protection on top, and to have the angled side armor along the lower part, as I've mentioned, and along the upper part of the mid, means you can just angle like this roughly, hide all of the lower plate, put your gun over here, and your opponents are going to have a real hard time of going through at least your hull armor if you don't sit still and make the weak point an issue. But even then, if your opponents are good at aiming, it doesn't matter if you sit still. This is still quite an easy shot to hit, as the tank isn't exactly going to be moving quickly. And if it is, even with vert stabs, you're not going to be able to get effective shots on your opponents as well. So, all in all, the TT-130M. It is a worse BZ-68, and I wouldn't recommend this tank at all for the tokens. Wait and see how good the TS-60 will be. Unfortunately, you're going to have to wait for June for that, because Wargaming don't give people like me the vehicle to play around with until it's actually obtainable. And because of its token price of 28, you aren't going to be able to get enough tokens in the first season. So wait for June. I'll play that tank, and then I'll give my final opinion as to whether you should spend your tokens as a tank collector on the TT-130M. I can't imagine I'm going to recommend spending them on this tank, or on the new American Reward Tank Destroyer. And honestly, boys and girls, if you don't already have a tank like the A Phase 1, if you don't have a tank like the Char Future 4, I'd recommend spending tokens on those vehicles. And if you didn't get the Cobra, unfortunately, the Cobra has actually gone up in price this time. I think it's going to cost 28 tokens because it's very good and it's a very popular tank. But I cannot imagine spending 20 tokens on this unless you've already got the Cobra, you've already got the Char, you've already got the A Phase 1, you've probably already got the 7772, and to all intents and purposes, you're going to get the new American Tier 9. And once again, as with pretty much the majority of tank releases recently, I think this is a missed opportunity for Wargaming. Slapping rockets on something is not enough if it doesn't have other fun aspects to the gameplay. And this one, it just misses out, in my opinion. I'm going to give it a big thumbs down. For fun, for novelty, and as an addition to World of Tanks. Anyway, ladies and gents, boys and girls, that was it for today. Really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. And let me know in the comments down below what you think about the TT-130M. And if you're watching this video as it's released on Friday, I'm going live all day on twitch.tv/QuickyBaby, where you can get new drops, tokens, to be able to get a whole series of Tier 6 premium tanks, epic styles, or maybe just get some 5x experience games and some premium time. So come along right now, get some fat loot, and hopefully see some good games. And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.